This is Lisa from Mobile Tech Review, and fun times here. I wish I could review more cameras. They take an awful lot of time to review. Honestly, though, I like to spend at least 3 weeks, sometimes even 4 weeks shooting with them. So far, mostly we've covered Sony cameras. They're my personal favorite lately. I used to be a Canon shooter. I used to have a Canon 60, but I've been convinced by the mirrorless revolution. I have the Sony A7 originally, and I've been hobbling along with it, even though it has, well, not the best autofocus and other things. So finally, not too many years, Sony has made so many improvements. We have the Sony A7 III, which has so many of the awesome points of much more expensive Sony full-frame cameras like the A9 and even the A7R III for $2,000, which for a full-frame camera is considered relatively affordable. It's pretty darn exciting stuff. The lens ecosystem is also widened. Granted, they've got a ways to go before they can match Canon and Nikon there, but still, for the body, you're looking at the same price as you would pay for the Canon 60 Mark II, and still cheaper than the aging, but still good, Nikon D750. There's a lot to love here. We're going to look at it now. So Sony, like I said, has been doing some wonderful things with their mirrorless cameras, particularly lately. At first it was a little bit of a rocky start when the original A7 came out, mostly due to autofocus not being the best, other things like that. But the A7S and the A7S II brought us incredible low-light performance, but more recently the A7R III is really the maturation of that high megapixel, 42 megapixel sensor camera, and then the A9, which is the apex of fast shooting and all sorts of nice stuff like that. Well, the interesting thing is their most affordable camera, the A7 III, brings in a lot of what we liked about what they've been doing with those much higher-end cameras. Certainly, there's still reasons if you want a higher resolution viewfinder, for example, EVF, then you're going to have to go the more expensive model. If you're not happy with 24 megapixels, though I think many people would be, if you want 42 megapixels, that's what the A7R III is about. So there's still deciding points, but it's interesting how close it's getting. And I think the A7 III here can be the main camera for a lot of folks, even for professional shooters, now that the lens selection has improved, where most of your staple, your core lenses are represented with fairly good quality lenses. So low light performance is top notch thanks to the backside illuminated sensor. Sony's been quite good at doing that, and it might not be quite A7S II level, which is it sees better in the dark than you and I can, but it's phenomenally good. Take a look at this photo taken of our cat at ISO 12,800. You tell me if you think that's a noisy picture. It certainly is not. And the nice thing is when there is some noise, and of course it's fair to have noise at high ISO, it's a very neat, tidy, not irritating kind of grain going on. So nice for low light, certainly. So things that I used to like to take pictures of, say, like we live in Texas. We get lots of awesome lightning. I used to rely on my Canon 60 to take those pictures. Now I can actually capture those with the A7 III. Of course, we have in-body stabilization. That's been a staple of Sony cameras for a couple of generations now, and it certainly is functional for effectively gaining you a couple more stops of exposure, and sometimes letting you shoot slower than the focal length of the lens. The usual rule, if you have a 50-meter lens, you should be shooting at 1/50th of a second. You can actually fudge that now. So for those of you who are shooting handheld, you're doing street, you're doing anything where you can't be using a tripod, this is pretty important stuff. Eye detection and face detection. Thank you, mirrorless cameras, for making these kinds of things possible. Now, I'm not allergic to manual focusing my gear. I've been shooting since the days of film and before autofocus even existed, but still, it's certainly nice to have, and it helps you capture that shot that you might have otherwise lost. The continuous autofocus mode actually is good. I was doing things like shooting a squirrel running across the lawn and doing crazy things, and most of those shots, I would say about 95% of them, were in proper focus. That's pretty impressive stuff. The eye autofocus usually does do the closest eye pretty well, detects it. And you'll see a sample photo of a fellow I took a picture of using the eye autofocus. It only works for people, though, not for animals, sadly enough. You get an insane number of focus points. We'll talk about that later with nearly full frame coverage. So that's why the autofocus is working so well. So for those of you who are thinking about the A6300 and the A6500, which were very good and still are for focusing, in fact, we use an A6300 to shoot all of our videos for our channel. Well, now if you wanted all that and you wanted full frame, you don't have to compromise. So to go on a little bit more about the autofocus, because it's pretty important, because this is something that was always a sore point for mirrorless cameras, and finally it isn't. 93% autofocus coverage. So that means right out to the edges of the frame. Nice, really nice, especially if you're doing subject tracking. There are 693 phase detection points, 425 for contrast detection. That's an insane amount, and that certainly beats digital SLRs that are on the market. What that means is it usually works. And compared to the A7 II, which was certainly an improvement of the original A7, that had 117 AF points. The original A7 had a drunken monkey doing focus. And I say that with love because I shot for years with that A7, and that's why I use direct manual focus a lot of the time, because it just was slow in low light and it would miss focus. So if you're coming from original A7, and understandably you might have waited and skipped a generation for upgrades, this is a brave new world, folks. By the way, for those of you who are still thinking about that A6300, because everybody knows, oh, it's really good for capturing action shots and it has a lot of autofocus points, it has 425 autofocus points, so we've still got even more here. It's fine for action. It is good. Battery capacity has doubled. There's a new Z battery. The only drawback is there are no aftermarket batteries yet. I'm sure they will be. The other drawback is Sony never includes the charger in the box. So you have to buy that separately for around 90 bucks or so. So otherwise you charge the battery in the camera, which is slower. That's what the drawback of that is. So anyway, double the shots brings it up to around an estimated 710 to 750 shots. Still falls short of digital SLRs, Nikons and Canons, but it is now useful. There's not as much in the way of battery anxiety. I don't carry a pocket full of batteries anymore. Back in the days when you only got 300 to 350 shots, or certainly at best an hour of video shooting. Now you can get up to 2 shooting 4K video. We finally have dual SD card slots, and I'm really surprised by this because usually it's the even higher end models, the so-called professional cameras, yes, the ones that are even more expensive than this, they get that. So for those of you who want to use this for mission critical work, you're a wedding photographer, obviously you can't tell folks, sorry, you're going to have your wedding again because my SD card crapped out. It's important to have for people to take this camera seriously, and in this price point, it's not something you necessarily would see. So good times there. We have 10 frames of continuous shooting now. That's pretty darn fast. Up to 8 frames with no blackout, which is nice. If you want even more than that, the A9 can do up to 20 frames per second continuous shooting. Of course, the A9 is $4,200 too. But that's pretty fast continuous shooting there. And for those of you who are really upset when Sony gave us compressed RAW files, now you can get uncompressed RAW files. You can still use compressed if you want to save space, but you got uncompressed RAW files available now. ISO is extremely well handled now, such that I generally felt pretty comfortable leaving it on automatic mode, because you can set the min and the max ISO to avoid unwanted extremes. You can also leave the minimum shutter speed set to auto with options to bias it faster or slower than one focal length. Like I was saying, 50mm lens, you want to go for 50 millimeters, but you can bias it a little bit now. We've got built-in wireless for sending photos to devices and remote control kind of stuff. That's just a staple feature these days. A mic and a headphone jack, obviously a must if you're doing this more seriously or professionally. So finally, Sony adds a touchscreen, but being passive-aggressive Sony, who really seems to hate touchscreens, oddly enough, for being a pretty technologically oriented company, you can only use it for focusing. So you can do touch focusing, but you can't use it to navigate their famously complex menu system. You can, however, set it to be basically right-eyed or left-eyed so that you don't nose focus a lot of the time. Or you can not use that feature at all, and you can just go with the new joystick for autofocusing, which is pretty sweet, and this is the one you're going to use if you tend to use the EVF anyway, because, well, you can't see the rear LCD, can you, when you're looking through the eyepiece. For video, folks, that's, again, one of the appeals of mirrorless is a lot more advanced and easier to use compared to digital SLRs. Obviously, the competing cameras from Canon and Nikon at this price point are still shooting 1080p video. Here we have 4K video, oversampled 4K video at that. We got S-Log2, we have S-Log3, we have the new hybrid log gamma format as well. So how about video quality? Well, you can see the photo of what our studio looks like today. It's a very cloudy day. We use a lot of natural light whenever we can from the window, so we're not getting a lot. Anyway, we're using the Sony a7 III to shoot this with the 24-70 f4 lens. Not particularly a video-centric lens, but it gets the job done. Anyway, you can get an idea of the video quality here, certainly compared to the a6300 that we usually use, and how well it focuses. Now, I don't move a lot, right? I can start to go, see if it focuses. Probably it's going to do fine. This is 4K, 30 frames per second, 100 megabit per second bit rate, so it's very high quality video. I'll leave it to you to decide how good this looks. So far, overheating hasn't been a problem with this, and Sony always says, oh, we're making it better so it won't overheat, but usually the bigger bodies don't overheat so much. It's the a6000 family of cameras that, because they're so small, they have a bit more of a challenge when it comes to thermals. This one, definitely better. For the ergonomics of the camera, sometimes getting bigger is better. Well, when Sony first came out with mirrorless cameras, the idea was to make these incredibly small full-frame cameras and APS-C size cameras. It's still smaller and on average 100 grams lighter than a competing digital SLR, but it got a little bigger. It needed to be because it was actually a little hard for a lot of us to hold on to. Now, I have pretty long fingers, granted, but I'm still a woman, so I don't have huge man hands or something like that. And I found a little hard to hold on to the older models. This one has the bigger battery grip, well, because there is a bigger battery. This is a good thing. A little more beef to the body allows them to offer more substantial lenses. The first lenses that they offered were understandably like the 24 to 70 millimeter Zeiss f4 lens that some people malign. It really is quite a capable lens though, but they tried to make it as small as possible to match the body size. So now the lenses are getting bigger and it makes sense to have the body be a little bit bigger ergonomically to match. Also, it makes room for more buttons, more custom controls, more C buttons. That's always a good thing as well. We have a tilting display, but still not fully articulated. I don't know what it is with Sony. They just really hate to give you a fully articulating display. So if you want to do selfie kind of stuff and you want to, flip it backwards or something like that, no, you can't do that. Tilting up is good for hip shots. Tilting down, like if you want to take pictures at a concert, not so much. As ever, you can use Canon, Leica, and Nikon lenses with adapters. Canon's usually the most popular because they have such a wide array of excellent lenses, and you can find a lot of them used for pretty good prices. There are affordable adapters out there, $100 or less. The one that I use was like $40, and it handles aperture, it handles shutter speed, and it doesn't really handle autofocus so much. Still, you kind of have to go with the $400 and up Metabones adapter if you want to get autofocus from your Canon, Nikon, and Leica glass contacts. You name it. They have a bunch of different adapters, so it depends on how you feel about manually focusing. Still, that's wonderful and versatile. It's something that you just can't do with other cameras, generally speaking. Adapt all sorts of other wonderful glass to them. So that's still a plus, certainly. Dynamic range is still a huge plus for Sony sensors, and we're talking a dynamic range of around 15 here. The A7 was good, and I could lift shadows, but with the A7 III, it's a noticeable difference of just how much I can lift. You can see on screen here how much I'm bringing up the shadows, and even more so, there's recovery from highlights that I didn't see before, and this beats many cameras on the market right now for what you can bring out. If you got your highlights are a little bit blown out, you need the detail back, no problem. If you're shooting at twilight like I like to do, and you need to bring up the shadows afterwards, you got beautiful dramatic skies, you can still preserve those while bringing up the landscape shadows. It's good stuff. Resolution is unchanged at 24 megapixels, but we do have a new backside illuminated sensor, like I said, which is why it's better in low light. You can take a look at these prints on the wall behind me here. I took these with 24 megapixel Sony sensor, 18 by 24 enlargements. Absolutely no problem with the detail that's on those. So you can do a lot with 24 megapixels. If you're a professional landscape photographer, you know who you are if you feel like you need more. If you need 42 megapixels, that's what the A7R III is for, That said, you also, if you're a hobbyist and you're just thinking more megapixels the better, I got the money to spend. One problem with the 42 megapixel sensor is you have to be even more careful with your shots. Any little handheld movement is going to be amplified by all the extra data that's going to be captured there. So be careful what you ask for. Like I said, if you know you need 42, you know who you are already. If you really aren't sure, 24 is really going to do a lot for you. For years, people didn't really love Sony JPEGs, and boy, did they do a lot here. I mean, I just ignored the JPEGs other than as a handy way to preview images when I was going through my RAW files quickly when looking at an SD card. Boy, it looks just about as good as what the new Adobe Photoshop CC 2018 has done with their new import RAW profiles there for the standard Adobe color profile. It's good stuff. You can still, obviously, if you need to lift shadows or bring back highlight detail and that sort of thing, there's work you can do, and if, all the latitude that you have with the RAW file, obviously, but what comes out of the camera is pretty darn brilliant at this point. And the sickly light green cast we used to see with Sony cameras, they've cured that finally, thank goodness. Tracking AF works well. Now, I am not a sports and action photographer particularly, so I'll confess I just did things like shoot squirrels running across the lawn and going crazy, that sort of thing. And it certainly did the job. And I'm shooting a few motocross drivers. That works out just fine as well. Is it going to be as good as a $4,000 competing digital SLR? Maybe not. But in this price range, yeah, you can have a lot of fun with this, certainly. And if you're buying this to capture your kid's basketball game or soccer or something like that, it will do the job. Okay, it's been years. Mirrorless cameras have been on the market, not just Sony's. We got Fuji's. I've reviewed a couple of those. Panasonic, they make some lovely cameras too. So it's always this versus a digital SLR. Well, to give you an idea, the heads of Canon and Nikon recently said at a trade show that mirrorless is the future, and they know it too. I know some of you traditionalists who love SLRs are going, no, 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 I'm hugging my pentaprism until the very end. I want my mirror. But it probably is true that in the future, everything will be mirrorless. There's just still too many advantages, and the drawbacks are pretty much going away. One of them is still battery life. And in part, that has to do with the technology being used here, but also the fact that so far mirrorless cameras are smaller bodied devices. As they enlarge them and enlarge the grip area, obviously battery life is going to improve. At this point, with 750 shots, we're getting something that's pretty acceptable. Things like true live view through the EVF, though, so you can see the effective aperture, real-time monitoring for video recording. You see exactly what you're getting. I mean, that's just something that's priceless. It's hard for me to think about going back to a digital SLR again at this point. Eye tracking, face detection. The smaller and lighter bodies certainly are a nice plus, too, given the fact that some DSLRs are just tanks. Huge, huge, heavy things to carry around. The 4K video with oversampling, the S-Log, all of those sorts of things made possible by these bodies, another wonderful thing. If you're a YouTuber like we are you shooting video for just about any reason short of working for Sony Motion Pictures, you know, you can do some amazing stuff with this now too. Obviously, there's no mirror slap or mirror shake, but you know, there is still some shutter shake there, but it helps to reduce anything like that. Focus peaking, for those of you who still like to use manual focus occasionally, like I said, I still do use direct manual focus when I'm doing macro shots. The visuals on screen for your focus peaking, very useful stuff. In the future, for continuous shooting speeds, I would imagine, you know, digital SLRs have pretty much hit a wall there because you can only move that mirror up and down so fast. So probably in the future, mirrorless cameras are going to be the leaders actually for continuous frame shooting. No lens calibration or micro adjustment is necessary because the nature of mirrorless cameras, because you don't have the variable of the mirror and the pentaprism and all that kind of thing where some fine tuning might be necessary. So nice to not have that hassle. Lastly, zooming in to check your focus with an EVF real-time. Wow, sweet stuff. So that's the Sony a7 III, and for the price, my God, is it nice. If you're serious about photography, either as a professional, a hobbyist, an amateur, finally, the continuous shooting speeds are getting good enough, and the autofocus is getting good enough that those of you who shoot sports can actually use this. Obviously, for those of you who shoot macro photography, landscapes, all that sort of thing, it's good. And the amount of detail that you're going to get in the image, like I said, the pictures behind me, 18 by 24 enlargements taken with a 24 megapixel Sony sensor, plenty good enough for all of that too. It's just impressive stuff here. The eye autofocus, the face detection, all those things that mirrorless brings really makes it worthwhile. The lens ecosystem too has greatly improved. Granted, they still have a ways to go, and like I said, the problem with Sony is the bodies are captivatingly affordable as this kind of gear goes, but the lenses are still pretty expensive for what you get. That's the only hurt. But then there's the fact that unique here, you can actually use adapted lenses. So particularly, I think a lot of people like to go for Canon lenses because there's such a wide variety of used lenses available that you can be shooting with the lens of your choice without breaking the bank, if you're okay with the adapter prices. I'm Lisa from Mobile Tech Review. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more cool tech videos, and thumbs up if you like this vid.